I'm Caroline Hart, 34 years old, and the night I stepped out of the car at my family's estate, the cold cut straight through my coat. Beyond the leaded glass light spilled over people who once decided I didn't belong among them. Inside, my father's laugh rose above the noise. My brother leaned in to catch every word, and my sister angled her phone for the best version of our last name. I tightened my grip on a leather portfolio that mattered more than the 12-foot doors I was about to walk through. 10 years earlier, I'd left this house with rain in my hair and no one following me to the driveway. I came back without diamonds, without entourage, without anything they expected to recognize as power. What I brought was quieter, heavier, and signed in ink they'd never imagined I could gather. Tonight was not a homecoming. It was a line I had waited a decade to cross. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments and tap like and subscribe if you've ever had to prove your worth in a room that once refused to hear you. I grew up in the shadow of machines and the hum of steady work, a child who preferred the factory floor to the ballroom, trailing behind my grandfather Henry as he pointed out why a shipment mattered and how a promise made to a supplier was a promise kept. He wore the same brown jacket year after year, kept a pencil behind his ear, and never raised his voice. He didn't need to, because people trusted him. He'd crouch beside me and say that value wasn't loud. It was consistent. My father favored different rooms, the paneled study, the club, the places where deals lived on paper and status, sat on the mantel next to silver frames. At our table, we were taught to say please and thank you, to send handwritten notes, to remember the names of workers on the line. I believed those small courtesies meant something until I learned they were only as strong as the person holding them. When I was old enough to read the numbers for myself, I noticed where corners were shaved, where a faster answer was chosen over the right one, and I asked questions like the girl I'd been at my grandfather's side. Polite questions attached to outcomes tied to timelines, questions that met a fist on mahogany. The old house smells the same each holiday: beeswax and wood polish, and a sweetness from the kitchen that never reaches the study. Nora once told me the scent of cinnamon carried better because it meant warmth, and I held that as a small fact that made sense in a place where other things didn't. I come from a family that prefers thick rugs and quiet hallways to front porches and open windows. A family that posts photographs of charity galas, while the people who make the meals slip out the back before the speeches begin. I was raised to send flowers after funerals and to keep our voices low when discussing cost. But I was also told eventually and clearly that not all opinions counted equally. When I moved to Austin with 2 suitcases and a stubborn plan, the contrast felt like stepping out of velvet into concrete. No polished staircase, no valet, just sublet keys that stuck in the lock, and a mat on the floor behind a borrowed desk. I learned how to brew office coffee in a dented French press and how to sleep with a spreadsheet open because I couldn't afford the time to close it. Those first months were paid for with a ring of pawnshop receipts and a willingness to be invisible long enough to build something that would not be. I kept the parts of my upbringing that fit. My hands show up early, learn the names of the night crew, follow the paper trail until it ends in a single decision, and I left the parts that asked me to nod along when the math didn't. Bridge North started as a title on a blank document because investors want names that sound like they've already been printed on glass. In a city where your worth is often measured by who walks in the door with you, I walked in alone and kept the door open for people whose resumes were written off for the wrong reasons. Integrity wasn't a slogan on our website. It was a vendor paid on time, a contract honored after a storm knocked out power, a call returned with an answer, even when the answer was no. The result wasn't dramatic or quick, and it certainly wasn't pretty. It was slow, it was patient, and it bought me one thing: I sorely needed options. By the time my last name on the internet became a footnote to the company I'd created, I had learned to move without announcement, to read a board packet the way my grandfather taught me to read a spec sheet, and to understand that quiet only looks like weakness to people who don't know where the signatures are. Now, standing in that marble foyer again, I can feel every lesson in the way my shoulders settle, in how I let my father's gaze slide past me without flinching, in how I nod to Nora when she presses a glass into my hand and whispers, "Welcome," with the kind of grace that never needed an audience. Jason's watch flashes, and Sloane's camera blinks, and the room fills with the kind of laughter that bounces off crystal and doesn't stick. I can map the house blindfolded from the dining room chandelier to the chair at the end of the table where I sat through toasts about legacy that didn't include my name. The portfolio at my side isn't a shield or a sword. It's a ledger of choices, mine and theirs, and the sum of those numbers has finally balanced in a way I can live with. I step toward the study door, the one that always closes just before the real conversation begins, and I hear my father's voice through the wood, even, and certain as if nothing in our history has shifted at all. My hand rests on the brass, and the room behind me quiets the way rooms do when they're waiting for the next line. The mahogany door stood half-closed, and my father's voice carried through as if the wood itself remembered how to amplify him. "We've kept her out of Henry's trust for a decade," he said, his tone clipped certain. My chest went still as I pressed into the shadowed paneling, the tumbler in my hand like an anchor. Then came Jason's laugh, casual and careless. "She doesn't know a thing about the amendments. Granddad might have imagined she'd run the company, but we fixed that fantasy long ago." Their words settled like ice, and I let my face remain calm, though every muscle beneath it wanted to break. I didn't need to see their expressions, to know the ease with which they erased me, how naturally my absence had become part of their story. When Jason's footsteps echoed into the hall, I slipped into the alcove, watching his watch glitter under the chandelier as he adjusted his cuff. The heavy desk in the study stood just beyond him, the portrait of my grandfather solemn above it. When the hallway cleared, I stepped inside, steady, as I crossed the rug, pulling open the familiar drawer on the right. There it was, labeled neat as always, Hart Family Trust amended. Page after page confirmed what I'd overheard, my name struck through provisions rewritten until my grandfather's intentions were buried beneath their signatures. I held my phone steady as I photographed each sheet one by one, each click soft and final. Nora's voice called from the hall that dinner was ready, and I placed the folder exactly where I found it. My face still set in composure, as if nothing in that room had shifted. The dining room gleamed with its endless shine, crystal and silver, reflecting back the family's performance of wealth. Father took the chair at the head Jason to his right, and Sloane adjusted her dress to catch the light of her phone, whispering into the lens for her followers. Mother's hand trembled as she lifted her wineglass, though her smile stayed fixed. I noticed the fourth pour, her eyes already softened at the edges. Conversation hushed as my father rose, his glass raised just enough to command attention. "Before we carve the turkey," he began, "I'll share the state of the company." Jason's shoulders lifted, ready for praise. Sloane barely looked up her phone, still angled high. "Hartwell Systems has finalized a sale. By year's end, our buyer will take the reins." My fork hovered above the plate, the words cutting sharper than any knife on the table. My father's eyes swept the room, landing on me at last. "This will allow us to streamline, cut loose the dead weight, and finally move forward." The message could not have been clearer if he had spoken my name outright. Jason raised his glass, grinning. "To my new role at the merged firm, and to the yacht I've already put a deposit on." Laughter rippled around him. Sloane tapped her screen, adding, "My new brand deals are already signed. This transition is a blessing for me." I watched their faces, their flushes of excitement, and the stiffness in the shoulders of the accountant seated nearby, as if the numbers themselves were uneasy. My father lifted his tumbler again. "To innovation," he declared, and the word on his tongue sounded more like abandonment. Sloane turned toward me, then her voice syrup-sweet. "At least now you won't have to pretend you were in line for anything." That must feel like a relief. Her smile was meant to cut, but my hands remained steady as I set down my glass. They believed they were celebrating victory, that my silence was weakness, that my return was nothing more than a visit. They didn't see the weight in the phone at my side, or the quiet strength I'd carried into this room. Their toasts clinked against crystal. Their laughter carried high, and for the first time in this house, I felt the power shift settle into my hands. Whether to reveal it now, or wait until their triumph burned itself out, that choice was mine. The moment would come soon enough, and it would not look the way they imagined. I let their laughter roll over me, each clink of crystal reminding me of the night I left this house with rain streaking the windshield. The study door had closed on my voice back then, and I had carried that silence all the way to Austin. Those first weeks I slept on a mat behind a borrowed desk, waking to the sound of trucks down the street. Showers came from the gym a block away, and meals were packets of noodles eaten while I kept my laptop balanced on my knees. The building smelled faintly of dust and paint thinner, but to me it was a chance, and I clung to it. The family lawyers had made their threats quickly, warning that if I ever attached the Hart name to my work, they would bury me in filings I couldn't afford to fight. So I became B.E. Quinn initials, without history, a name that could slip into meetings without questions about legacy. The quiet suited me. It let me build without interference, though it came at the cost of everything familiar. The heaviest sacrifice was my grandfather's pocket watch, the one he had pressed into my hand when I was still in school. I had pawned it for the price of a month's server rental, telling myself that time itself would return it if I made it matter. There were nights when doubt sat heavier than the walls, when my father's words replayed, "You don't contribute, you don't belong." I would stare at the spreadsheet glowing in the dark and wonder if he had been right. But doubt never paid invoices. So I stayed at that desk 18 hours at a stretch cold coffee beside me until contracts began to line up and suppliers who had been dismissed by Hartwell listened to the quiet woman behind the Quinn name. Every signature that arrived felt like a step back across the marble floor of this house, though no one here knew it. I kept purchasing small parcels of Hartwell stock through holding companies, never in amounts large enough to draw notice, but steady as a heartbeat. Watching them mismanage from afar only confirmed what I already knew: they were burning through the foundation Henry had poured in concrete and sweat. Nora slipped a plate of dessert in front of me, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder before she moved on. She leaned just enough to whisper, "He would be proud." My throat tightened at her words. The recognition I had once begged from my father came in a quiet murmur from the woman who had polished these floors longer than I had been alive. I kept my gaze on the pie as the room filled again, with Jason's voice boasting about teak decks and yacht lengths. He passed his phone around the table like a prize, making sure it skipped over me as if my eyes could not recognize value. Sloane rose next, smoothing her dress and holding her phone high. "Family photo," she announced, shifting the angle so the shot cut me out cleanly. Her screen lit with the caption before she sat back down, the word "blessed" shining in the glow. I lifted my glass and let the cool water wash away the sting, knowing that pictures could erase, but documents could not. In my pocket, evidence-weighted images of amended trusts, proof of intent, bent away from Henry's wishes. I had carried weight for years, and tonight I carried it into this dining room without them even seeing. The conversation drifted to contracts and brand deals, and my father lifted his glass again. To family loyalty, he said, his eyes pointedly skipping over mine. The guests shifted their glances sharp at the edges, pity hanging heavier than the candle smoke. Mother's hand shook as she raised her wine, nearly spilling, and I wondered how many years she had steadied herself with glasses like this. Jason laughed again, leaning close to describe the yacht's custom finish, and Sloane typed furiously with her head bent low, as if her future depended on the right caption more than the truth of the moment. I held still, letting memory flood in the pawnshop counter where I laid down Henry's watch, the echo of his voice telling me that time was the only resource I could never replace. I thought of the server racks humming in that bare room in Austin paid for with that sacrifice, the glow of their lights brighter to me than chandeliers. I thought of the vendors who had taken a chance on Quinn when Hartwell ignored them, of the signatures that built Bridge North contract by contract. The path had been carved with doubt pressing close, but doubt had never won. Across the table, Nora caught my eye again and gave the smallest nod, as if she knew what sat waiting in my pocket. The room carried on around me, the same walls, the same voices, but the balance had shifted. They still believed I was the daughter who left with nothing but rain in her hair. They had no idea that the company they mocked had already stepped into their house with me. I lifted my glass steady now and let the thought settle. The time for silence was ending, though the exact moment of my voice was yet to come. The candles burned low, their light shifting across silver and crystal when my father rose again. He tapped his knife against his glass, the room quieting as if trained to fall in line at the sound. His expression held satisfaction, the kind of calm that came only when he believed he had outmaneuvered everyone. As of this week, he announced, "Hartwell Systems has been sold. None of you will be seeing a dime from the deal." The words rang sharp, slicing through the table chatter. For the first time all evening, Jason's face drained of color, and Sloane dropped her phone onto her plate with a clatter. Jason leaned forward, his voice tight. "That isn't legal. I'll contest it." Father waved him off, barely sparing him a glance. "The contract is signed. $57 million, a generous offer considering performance in recent years." His tone carried weight, and yet when his eyes flicked toward me, I felt the dismissal as clearly as if he had pushed me from my chair. I set down my glass with care, my voice steady. "Who is the buyer?" The table stilled, every guest watching as though I had spoken out of turn in a place that never permitted it. "Everton Holdings," my father replied, drawing out the word slowly. "A technology conglomerate based in Chicago." I rose from my chair, the napkin sliding to the floor at my feet. "That's me." Silence fell so hard that even the sound of Nora entering with the coffee service seemed loud. She set a porcelain cup before me first, her choice deliberate before moving on with the tray. The quiet respect in her gesture was the anchor I needed. I reached for the portfolio at my side, sliding out a thick document stamped with signatures. Perhaps I should introduce myself properly. I am B.E. Quinn, CEO of Bridgenorth Technologies. Everton is a subsidiary. The board voted unanimously, 8-0. My father's face blanched as he bent closer, his eyes catching on the logo at the top of the page. The stylized bridge across a rising sun was the same sketch my grandfather had drawn in the margins of his first business plan. I watched recognition pass over him, followed quickly by disbelief. "That's not possible," he muttered, but the conviction had already drained from his voice. Jason pushed his chair back abruptly. "You can't just, this is espionage. You stole our clients." I laid another set of documents across the table. "Contracts signed willingly after your mismanagement. Would you like me to list the failures that sent them away? Or should I start with the 3 consecutive delays on the Westlake project?" Sloane's phone slipped again, this time from her hands to the carpet. Father's jaw clenched. "I'll have this invalidated. The board would never approve it." From the portfolio, I produced the minutes of the last meeting's signatures lined across the page. After Jason's embezzlement was discovered, they were eager for change. His voice cracked. "That's a lie." I pulled a small drive from the leather case. "The forensic accounting is thorough. If you prefer, I can play the recording of the emergency session where your CFO detailed the transfers to offshore accounts." The guests shifted uncomfortably, the room filled with unease as my father's authority collapsed in front of them. The doorbell rang, then its tone carrying through the house. Nora reappeared at the entry, her eyes steady as she addressed me. "Mr. Cole is here, Miss Hart. Shall I bring him in?" I nodded once. Moments later, Evan stepped into the dining room, his leather briefcase tucked neatly in his hand. He greeted the table with quiet confidence, then set the transition documents on the mahogany surface. "Good evening. The board's approval supersedes management in cases of malfeasance. These papers formalize the transfer." Jason sputtered, "Malfeasance. That's slander." I leaned forward, my voice even. "It's only slander if it isn't true. Would you like me to explain the wire transfers myself, or shall I let the record speak?" Jason's shoulders sagged, the bluster gone. Across from me, Sloane stared, her voice thin. "What about my ambassador contract?" I met her eyes. "Terminated yesterday along with the expense account that funded your Aspen trip." Father gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles pale. "This is my company." He insisted, his voice quieter now. "I built it." I shook my head, placing my hand gently on the page with Henry's sketch. "Grandfather built it. You were its caretaker. And you failed." For the first time all evening, Mother's eyes steadied on mine, her hand lowering her glass untouched. Evan slid the last sheet toward my father. "This confirms operational control. effective immediately. My father stared at the paper as though it might burn him, his pen unmoving. The weight of years seemed to press into his shoulders, his certainty slipping away. Beside him, Jason shifted restlessly, already calculating. Sloane tapped at her phone again, the screen lighting her face with frantic glow. I stood at the head of the table, portfolio open, the truth laid out for everyone to see. For a decade, they had treated me as though my silence proved weakness. Tonight, the documents on this table had given my silence a voice. The room no longer belonged to him, and everyone knew it. My father looked up at me, his expression one I had not seen in years, uncertainty. His words, when they came, were quiet. What happens now? The question hung in the air, heavy and unresolved, as the firelight flickered across the portrait of Henry on the far wall. I gathered the papers, my answer not yet spoken, but already written in the steps I had taken to reach this moment. The time for silence was over, and what followed would reshape everything they believed about legacy. The dining room still carried the echo of my father's words, but now every face was turned toward me. The weight of years pressed on the table between us, yet for the first time it was my silence that held control. My father leaned forward, his voice softened to a tone I hadn't heard since childhood. "Caroline," he said, the old nickname catching on his tongue. "Let's be reasonable. Keep the company if you must, but there's room here for family." His smile stretched thin, and Jason was quick to nod beside him. "I could advise on operations," he offered, the eagerness in his tone not quite masking the calculation in his eyes. "I'd keep my current arrangements, of course, but I'd lend my expertise where you need it." I held his gaze for a moment before shifting to Sloane, who finally raised her eyes from her phone. "My followers would love a redemption story," she said brightly. "A family business reborn under your leadership. I could be the face of the rebrand." Their words hung in the air, each cloaked in survival more than sincerity. My father cleared his throat, playing what he must have thought was his strongest card. "Your grandfather always said business stays in the family. He would hate to see you tearing it apart out of spite." The words landed with precision, aimed at the girl who had once trailed behind Henry across factory floors, memorizing part numbers while her siblings stayed home. I reached for the clasp on my portfolio, the sound of it snapping open louder than the hum of the chandelier above us. "Grandfather gave me this the summer before he died." I drew out a yellowed folder, its edges worn soft from the years I had kept it hidden. I laid it flat on the table. "The original trust document, the one you told the attorneys was lost." My father's face drained of color as I slid it across the polished surface. The notary's stamp still stood in black at the bottom of the page, its seal intact. Section 4. Paragraph 3. I read aloud, tracing the faded line with my finger. "My granddaughter, Caroline Elizabeth Hart, shall receive controlling interest in Hartwell Systems upon reaching the age of 30, regardless of management decisions." Jason lurched forward. "That can't be legal." I didn't raise my voice. It was notarized, witnessed, and filed with the state. I never used it because I wanted to succeed on my own terms, not because I couldn't. I turned another page in the portfolio, the edges sharp against my hands. Bridge North wasn't chosen at random. Nova means new. Bridge honors grandfather's vision-building connections, not exploiting them. Across the table, my mother's hands rested in her lap, her wine untouched for the first time that evening. She watched me steadily, her expression unreadable, but present in a way it hadn't been in years. I laid out the plans I had brought with me, contracts and projections stacked in neat order. The innovation division will rehire the engineers Jason cut. The product lines abandoned despite steady margins will return. The equity program that attracted the brightest talent will be restored. My father's lips parted as though to argue, but no words came. The dining room seemed to contract around us, every candle flicker echoing off silver, as though waiting for the sound of a decision. He led the way to his study, perhaps out of habit, perhaps because it had always been his ground. The heavy curtains still shut out the evening, the leather chairs positioned too large for me when I was young. Evan placed the final acquisition papers on the desk, the mahogany surface scarred with years of decisions. My father straightened his shoulders, clinging to the old tone of authority. "You can't possibly understand this business," he said, as if the 10 years I had spent away could erase what I had built. "You've been gone." I lifted the pen, its weight steady in my hand. "Your costs rose 18%, while quality dropped 22%. Server systems are 3 generations out of date. You're paying triple market rate for storage because Jason cut the IT director to fund his boat." Each word landed with the stroke of ink across paper. "The Austin distribution center runs at 30% capacity because you refused automation that would have paid for itself in 14 months. And you've lost your best talent because the equity program grandfather designed was dismantled." The sound of my signature filled the room. I reached for the nameplate on the desk, Richard Hart, CEO, and slid it into the drawer. From my portfolio, I withdrew a restored brass plate, Henry Hart, Founder. I placed it at the center of the desk, the letters catching the light. Jason shoved back his chair, muttering about lawyers, his footsteps storming down the hall. Sloane followed already on her phone, her voice rising in rapid tones to her agent. My father stood alone in the room, smaller now, against the shelves and portraits that once amplified his strength. The board's decision was final, the papers sealed. I gathered the documents into the portfolio and closed the clasp with a firm snap. "The board wants a full audit," I said evenly, meeting my father's eyes. "Jason's financial decisions will face particular scrutiny." The words were neither a threat nor a promise, only fact. He swallowed hard, his gaze shifting away. Behind him, my mother remained seated in the leather chair by the window, her hands folded neatly. She did not move to follow the others, did not pour another glass of wine. Her voice came low but clear. "Caroline," she said, "we need to talk." I turned to her, the weight of her steady gaze holding me in place. The room felt different now, not just because of the signed papers, but because for the first time in years, my mother's eyes were unclouded. She had chosen this moment to speak. The fire snapped in the hearth, and the sound of Jason's car door slamming echoed faintly through the walls. I met her eyes, uncertain of what words she had held back all these years, but certain that what came next would change more than the company. The fire burned low in the hearth when my mother's request settled between us. Jason's footsteps had faded. Outside, Sloane's voice had gone silent down the hall, and the house seemed to hold its breath. She sat near the window, her hands resting loosely in her lap, her posture composed in a way I hadn't seen in years. "Caroline," she said again, her tone even, "I need to tell you something." I crossed the room and lowered myself into the chair across from her, the same chair where so many of my words had once been ignored. She studied me for a long moment, her expression softer now than the porcelain mask she wore at dinners. "I knew what your father and Jason were doing," she admitted quietly. "I didn't know the details, not at first, but I knew enough to understand you were being pushed aside." My chest tightened at her words, but I stayed silent, letting her continue. She folded her hands together. "For years I thought staying quiet kept the peace, that if I didn't challenge him, I could shield you in smaller ways. But silence doesn't protect anyone, does it?" Her voice broke just slightly before she steadied it again. I leaned forward, the weight of her confession pressing hard against me. "Why now?" I asked. Her eyes lifted clear and focused. "Because I see what you've built. Because tonight you've taken back what should have been yours all along. And because I don't want my silence to be the last thing you remember about me." The firelight flickered across her face, and for a moment she looked younger, like the woman who once tucked me in with whispered stories when my father stayed late at the office. My father cleared his throat, then shifting from his stance by the desk. "We can work something out," he said, the edge gone from his tone. "You have the company, yes, but surely there's a place for family." Jason had returned to the doorway, his voice sharp and pleading. "Keep me on the payroll, Caroline. I know the systems. I can help." Sloane hovered behind him, her phone still in hand. "My platform could give this company reach you'd never get otherwise." Their words tumbled over each other, desperate bargaining. I drew a slow breath and reached again for the portfolio. From its pocket, I pulled a second document, the one my grandfather had handed to me years ago, in a quiet moment that carried more trust than any board meeting. I laid it flat on the desk, turning it so my father could see. "This is the trust you told the lawyers had gone missing," I said calmly. His hands trembled as his eyes moved across the faded ink. Henry made sure I had it, I continued. He knew what you might try to do. Jason stepped forward, his face flushing. That can't stand in court. My hand rested on the notary stamp, the ink still visible. It already has. The silence that followed was heavier than any outburst could have been. My father's voice finally broke it, but this time it was stripped bare. What do you want from us? The question, simple as it was, felt like the first honest words he had spoken in years. I met his gaze without flinching. I don't want anything from you. I'm here to restore what mattered to grandfather, not to bargain for scraps of loyalty. Evan slid the final set of papers forward. Operational control has been transferred. The audit will move forward immediately. Any improprieties will be addressed by the board. Jason muttered under his breath, but even he seemed to recognize that there was nothing left to fight. The clock in the corner ticked steadily as I gathered the papers, each sound a reminder that the balance of power had shifted. My father slumped back into the leather chair, diminished. Jason stormed out once more, his footsteps heavier this time, and Sloane followed, tapping furiously on her phone. Only my mother remained, her gaze steady on me. She reached across the desk and placed her hand over mine, her palm warm and firm. Henry always said you understood value better than anyone, she said softly. I think he knew you would carry this further than he ever could. The study door closed behind them, leaving only the two of us in the quiet. The papers lay signed, the nameplate replaced the founder's vision, restored to its rightful place. Yet the air still held something unresolved, something I knew the next hours would bring to the surface. My mother's hand tightened slightly on mine, her eyes intent. There's more I need to tell you, she said, something I should have said long ago. The fire popped, sending a small ember into the grate, and I waited for her words, knowing they would shape not only the company's future, but the family's as well. My mother's words lingered in the air, but the sound of hurried footsteps soon broke the stillness. Jason stormed back into the study, his face red, phone pressed tightly to his ear. I'll call our lawyers, he muttered, though his tone had lost conviction. Behind him, Sloane followed, her heels sharp against the wood floor, scrolling rapidly with frantic fingers. She looked up at me with wide eyes. My agent needs clarity on my contract, she said, as if a signature could rewrite what had already been sealed. I remained seated at the desk, the papers neatly stacked before me. Evan stood at my shoulder, calm and unyielding, while Nora quietly slipped into the room, carrying a tray of fresh coffee. She set it down gently, her eyes meeting mine for a brief second, her expression resolute. My father stayed slouched in the leather chair, his hand gripping the armrest. This is my company, he repeated, but the words carried no weight. The board has spoken, Evan replied evenly. He placed another folder in front of my father. This outlines the audit schedule. All financial records will be reviewed starting Monday morning. Any misuse of funds will be reported directly to the committee. Jason's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Sloane lowered her phone, the light from the screen washing pale across her face. I leaned forward, speaking clearly. Your expense accounts are closed. The travel budgets the contracts tied to influence, they're gone. What remains will be examined carefully. My father flinched at the word, examined, his gaze falling to the floor. Jason stepped forward, his voice sharp. You're tearing this family apart. I met his eyes without wavering. The family tore itself apart when it betrayed grandfather's vision. Tonight is the consequence. The silence that followed was thick, interrupted only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. My father lifted his head slowly, his features drawn, his voice quieter than I had ever heard. What happens to us now? The question carried no command, only weariness. I drew the original trust closer to me, its faded ink glowing in the firelight. You will step aside. The board will review the audit. Whatever remains will be decided according to law and record. Jason's bluster faltered. He glanced at Sloane, then at my father, searching for footing that no longer existed. Sloane finally broke the silence, her words tentative. And me. Her voice trembled, stripped of performance. I looked at her, my tone even. You'll need to find your own footing just as I did. Her phone slipped into her lap. her shoulders sagging as if the truth had finally caught her. Evan gathered the final signatures, sliding them into his briefcase with precise care. "That concludes the transition," he said. His voice was calm, final. My father closed his eyes briefly, then pushed back the chair with a scrape of leather on wood. He rose slowly, his stature diminished, his movements heavy. Without a word, he left the study, his footsteps retreating down the hallway that had once echoed with certainty. Jason followed, muttering under his breath, and Sloane lingered a moment longer before slipping away, her heels softer this time. The study was quiet now, the documents secure, the authority transferred. My mother remained in her chair by the window, her hands steady in her lap. She met my eyes, and for the first time that night I saw no fear there, only resolve. "Caroline," she said softly, "it's done, the company is yours, but there is something else, something you need to hear." The fire crackled, throwing a warm glow against the brass nameplate of Henry Hart, founder, gleaming at the center of the desk. The house outside seemed hushed, as though waiting for the weight of her next words. I sat back in the chair, the leather firm against my shoulders, bracing for what was to come. My mother's voice carried softly across the study as the fire dimmed to embers. She confessed that she had known pieces of what my father and Jason were doing, that silence had seemed easier than confrontation, and that fear had kept her bound for years. I listened not with anger, but with the heaviness of understanding. When she reached across the desk, her hand steady over mine, I realized it was the first time in a decade she had chosen to stand beside me rather than fade into the background. That small choice mattered more than I expected. 6 months later, my days began not in my father's paneled office, but in the open glass walls of Bridgenorth. We had merged the legacy of Hartwell with a new name, Novacrest Technologies. The name honored Henry's vision of building bridges and carried forward the innovation that had been denied for so long. My leadership team gathered each morning, not around a long table with one seat of power, but in a circle where every voice carried equal weight. People who had once been overlooked in traditional firms now shaped the future we were building together. Our numbers rose, but what meant more was how we achieved it. Contracts came not through manipulation, but through trust. Clients returned, employees who had been cast aside found purpose again, and even the suppliers my grandfather had once worked with wrote to say they felt his spirit in our work. I kept Henry's brass nameplate on my desk and his old pocket watch locked in a glass case nearby, reminders that legacy lives only when it is honored. Nora retired from the estate and joined me as my assistant. She greeted every visitor with warmth, the kind that couldn't be bought. Evan became not only my attorney, but a close advisor, the kind who reminded me when to push forward and when to pause. And my mother, 6 months sober now, found her footing in mentoring young women, starting small businesses, offering them the guidance she wished she had taken herself. I watched her speak at one of our foundation events, her voice steady as she told them that silence serves no one. It was the first time I saw pride shining openly in her eyes. Jason's fate was less gentle. The audit uncovered financial improprieties that could not be explained away, and indictments followed. He fought it at first, but even he seemed relieved when the facade finally cracked. Sloane, stripped of contracts that had been funded by company accounts, began posting fewer photos of herself and more words about rebuilding. It wasn't much, but it was a start. My father moved into a smaller home on the edge of town, his empire gone, his voice no longer echoing through boardrooms. The last time we spoke, he asked about the company he once claimed as his. I told him it was steady, and that was enough. One evening I hosted a small gathering at my apartment overlooking the city. Evan leaned against the balcony rail, Nora refilled glasses, and my mother arranged flowers in a vase she had brought from the estate. We toasted not to victory, but to rebuilding. To building rather than breaking. My mother said her sparkling water raised high. Her voice was stronger than I had ever heard it, and the words felt right. Later that night, after everyone had gone, I stood before the case in my office where Henry's old laptop sat beside his restored pocket watch. The screen was cracked, the keys worn, but the plans typed into its files had built the foundation for everything we were now doing. I pressed my hand against the glass and thought about the long road from that rainy night I left with nothing but determination to the moment I walked back through the estate doors with evidence in my pocket. Justice had not come quickly, and it had not come without scars, but it had come. And standing there, I understood something my grandfather had tried to teach me long ago. Legacy is not what you inherit. It is what you choose to build day by day, choice by choice. For me, reclaiming what was taken mattered, but creating something new mattered more. If you've ever felt dismissed or underestimated, I hope my story reminds you that silence does not mean weakness, and patience does not mean surrender. Sometimes the greatest justice comes not in destroying the past, but in building a future that outshines it. Thank you for listening to my journey. If it touched you, share it with someone who might need the reminder. And let me know where you're listening from. I'd love to hear your story too.